Hey everybody, it's Matthew. I'm back yet again with another Alice in Chains month video. And you guys know how all kinds of bands have interesting backstories and info and lore about them. I like looking at that kind of stuff with my favorite bands, and I hope you guys do too, because today we're going to be looking at some info and a backstory and some facts about Alice in Chains. So starting with Jerry Cantrell, his backstory is a little bit interesting. He, of course, grew up in kind of a poor family. His dad was a Vietnam War veteran, and that put some strain on the family, and it did eventually lead to the divorce of his parents. And his mother ended up moving out to Washington in Tacoma, and Jerry went to live with her. And things were still tough for them up there in Seattle. He bounced around different things. He did, of course, settle on getting interested in the guitar. Those things, managed to get a cheap one to learn on, and he bounced around, did different things. Later, he started trying to play around in bands, and stuff wasn't always working out. So he ended up actually spending a couple years in Texas, and there's also a little factoid that I saw one time that he did meet Pantera in an early version of the band before they would obviously become the famous Pantera that we know today. Eventually he went back to Washington, was still homeless, but in the meantime, our boy Lane Staley was getting things started. He started out playing drums actually, but eventually got interested in singing and then tried out for a local glam band called Sleaze. And that's what he did when he was pretty young. He was like 17 or 18. Eventually, the band was going to change their name to Alice in Chains, and upon, of course, that being a bit of a strange name that sent a weird message, they decided to replace the N with the letter N apostrophe, which would be Alice and Chains. Meanwhile, of course, Jerry had his own band at the time called Diamond Lie, and he was, of course, still homeless at this point. Eventually finding his way to the Music Bank studio to work on some stuff, and of course met Lane there. Mentioned he didn't have a place to live, so Lane was already living at the Music Bank, so he offered to let Jerry stay with him, and that's how they first got together. And of course, things between both of their respective bands weren't working out. I think Jerry's band was still technically together, but Alice in Chains ended up breaking up, I think. And then, of course, Jerry wanted some people to jam with, and Lane knew some people. He happened to have Sean Kinney's phone number, and he gave that to Jerry. So Jerry called him up, had him come in, and they started jamming and playing together. They needed a bass player, of course. Sean's girlfriend at the time was actually Mike Starr's sister, and she mentioned that he played bass, and it turned out he and Sean had played together growing up, and so it was an easy thing just to bring him in to start jamming, but they still did not have a singer. And what is a band to do? Well, you got a guy that's a really good singer right in front of you at the Music Bank, but he didn't really want to do it. He pitched the idea of joining the band with Jerry if Jerry promised to join a band that Lane was working on at the time as a sideman. So it was this whole thing, but he really was kind of reluctant to join Jerry's thing as a full member. Eventually, Jerry thought it would be a funny joke to start trying out really terrible singers, and in fact the final thing that made Lane's decision easy was Jerry tried out a male stripper for the position, and well, Lane got the point by then and said yes to being the band's full-time singer. And they, of course, eventually end up asking his old bandmates, can we use the old name for this band? And they ended up agreeing, and then we have the Alice in Chains that we all know and love today. So now let's talk about a few things with the music and about how some of the songs and things came to be. Of course, their first album, Facelift, was pretty much entirely written by Jerry. Lane did supply the lyrics on a few things, but most of the meat of the songs was written by Jerry, and a lot of the songs dealt with deeply personal issues and relationships. And one of those personal songs on the album was Sunshine, which is a song about Jerry Cantrell's mother, who had sadly actually passed away from cancer a few weeks before Alice in Chains had started as a band in 1987. And the other really sad fact was his grandmother had actually also died of cancer 2 months prior to that. So it was a really difficult time for Jerry. And this beautiful song, Sunshine, came out of that. And that's one of the deeper tracks on the album. But it's interesting how we got some of these really dark backstories here turning into these great songs. Another fun fact about the Facelift album is when the guys were working on demos and different things, getting prepared, to start actually working on an album. The Music Bank, which is the place where the studio Lane worked at, that they had been working on stuff in, got raided in one of the biggest marijuana raids in the history of the state of Washington. So they almost did not get everything ready to go. Fortunately, they did salvage one of the demo tapes out of it that had a few of their songs on it, and it's called the Treehouse tapes. And they were fortunately able to send that off, and a lot of people were very impressed by that, and they were able to get their album funded and get it recorded elsewhere, so lucky them. Around, there's an interesting backstory with the album Sap. Initially, they were working on some demos for their next full-length album, which included about 10 songs on it. They had a lot of them that ended up being these interesting acoustic tracks, and apparently Sean had come in one day and said he had had a dream about them making an EP called Sap, and the band thought that was fate, so they packaged together those acoustic songs as their own thing and released it as the EP Sap, and then saved the other half of the songs for the next album. There's also a hidden track on the end of the album that is called Love Song, and it's a weird album where all the band members switch their instruments, and it's Sean on vocals and piano, Lane on drums, Jerry on bass, and Mike Starr on guitar. Then we go to Dirt now. There's a lot of information that we already know about this album, but some of the fun stuff you may not know about this is that they were in the process of recording for the album when the LA riots broke out over the beating of Rodney King, and the band decided, after seeing a lot of the violence that was happening, that it was safer to just leave Los Angeles completely, and they left, and apparently, I guess, ran into Tom Araya from Slayer at some point on the way, and they all went out to the desert in California around the Joshua Tree area, and they hung out there until things calmed down. And of course, Tom Araya would come back and help the band out by doing that little silly number on the album that is typically listed as untitled, but the official title of it is Iron Gland, and it's that weird goofy song with this ridiculous guitar riff, and Tom is just screaming on it, much the same way he does on Slayer. And then Jar of Flies has a crazy backstory because that happened in kind of a whirlwind. The band just decided, we're just going to go in the studio with a bunch of acoustic instruments and just see what happens, because they were bored, I guess. And they recorded everything for it in 7 days, working 14 to 18 hour days, that's a hell of a schedule to record an album, but they got that done really quick. And also the title of the album is based on an interesting experiment that Jerry had done when he was in school about flies. He had 2 jars of flies. One, the flies would be overfed, and then in the other, the flies would be underfed. The overfed ones multiplied very quickly, but eventually they would die very quickly because they were overcrowded. And then the underfed ones, they multiplied much more slowly. There were much fewer of them, but they survived much longer. And Jerry thought that was an interesting thing. Maybe there's a metaphor in there, and so he thought that would be a cool title to just call it Jar of Flies. So, and then of course after that, the band decided to go on hiatus because Lane had been having worse and worse drug issues. He went to rehab. It didn't work out. He ended up back on heroin again. So the band just went on hiatus. Lane went back to rehab a second time, and this one was a little bit more successful. And then coming out on the other end, he decided to form the supergroup Mad Season with Pearl Jam guitarist Mike McCready. And then, of course, Barrett Martin and John Baker Saunders also joined up in the band. They had a full 4-piece together. And the idea of the band was that if everyone was making music together, everyone would stay sober together. And they made a really awesome album, but unfortunately, their experiment to keep everyone sober, despite them even having material coming up for a second album, it didn't work out. Everyone did not stay sober. Eventually, the band broke up. John Baker Saunders also sadly died. So the Mad Season thing was kind of over. It was really sad. Of course, after the first Mad Season album was done and they had done their little tour, Lane did eventually come back to Alice in Chains, and they got to work again on their self-titled album. And the interesting thing about that is the story behind the cover was they had that idea for a three-legged dog because Sean was talking about how he had a three-legged dog that used to terrorize him when he was on his paper route as a kid. And he thought that would be an interesting concept for the title. So they did a few photo shoots asking for three-legged dogs, got a few pictures of some, and they didn't look that great. Eventually, the band got some fax image somewhere that had a three-legged dog on it, and they decided that would be a good one. Actually, Jerry and Mike decided that, and Mike Inez now at this point, because Mike Starr was no longer in the band, they decided that that would be a cool cover. Sean was kind of upset because, they spent money on the photo shoot, ended up not using those pictures, but, whatever, the picture they chose ended up working out just fine. And then, of course, after that, the band did some more tours, but unfortunately, Lane's drug use got worse and worse, and it was getting severely in the way of them being able to tour and do anything. So the band, of course, thought it best once again to go on a hiatus and not continue with what they were doing because it was not going to be good for anyone trying to tour in that condition. So, of course, other stuff starts to happen. Jerry goes and works on his first solo album, and everybody goes their separate ways. They did come together for a little bit to do a couple of more songs. Get Born Again and Died were both recorded subsequently in 1998 and then released on the Music Bank. After all that stuff, Jerry goes back to work on another album and starts touring solo once again. Of course, prior to that, in the year 2000, he's introduced to the band Comes With the Fall, and their singer at the time, William Duvall, and he asked them to join him on his tour as his opening act and his backing band. And of course, we know Will would be there to sing Lane's parts on the Alice in Chains songs that Jerry would perform during his solo tours. After that tour, and that we know the whole thing about Lane sadly passing away, and the band having to deal with that unfortunate situation. His second solo album came out just a couple of months after Lane had died, and it was a tough period for everybody. Eventually, the guys started talking again, talking about different things here and there, very slow process of, getting back into the swing of things, eventually start jamming together and stuff like that, and notice that they have some new ideas and things, and they decide they want to tour again as Alice in Chains. But of course, not having the singer, they open up auditions for it, and of course, William Duvall comes back for the audition for the band. He sang Love, Hate, Love once, and Jerry was like, well, the search is over. He's perfect for us. Let's get him in the band. And then, of course, Black Gives Way to Blue was the album they recorded together with William joining the band. And the fun fact about this is the recording for the album was finished on Jerry's 43rd birthday, which is also the same day that William Duvall's son was born. So that's an interesting little fact there, that Jerry and William's son share a birthday. Then we get to The Devil Put Dinosaurs Here, period, which is an interesting time. This album got severely delayed because Jerry had to have some shoulder surgery for a repetitive strain injury, and it sidelined him for several months, and so the band could not work on the album. But what's more interesting, maybe, is the concept of the album, which the title references an old fundamental Christian belief that the devil had planted dinosaur bones in the earth in order to dissuade people from believing the creation story, which is a really weird, funny thing. We, of course, know how dinosaurs are here and that that's a load of nonsense. But more importantly, the album was also a concept album about the hypocrisy of organized religion. And if you follow the songs, they tell a really interesting story about a person sort of experiencing the organized religion culture and eventually falling out of favor with it. So it's really a fascinating album. And now we're getting close to present day. The band's most recent album, Rainier Fog in 2018, was recorded, of course, over the year 2017 and part of 2018. An interesting story about the album is that after Chris Cornell had passed away, before they had started working on the new record, one of Chris Cornell's sisters had gifted the band one of Chris's acoustic guitars, which they played on a few different tracks on the album. Not sure which one specifically, but it said it was widely used on the album. So that was a really cool homage to Chris to use his guitar on the album. Last thing about Rainier Fog is an interesting thing because I've never heard of a band doing this. One of the ways they promoted the album was they did a scavenger hunt. So throughout Seattle, they scattered a few of these exclusive tickets, and fans that were able to solve the scavenger hunt, of course, would get these tickets to a secret event that the band said was going to be occurring. And once it was solved, they revealed that they were having a secret gig at the Crocodile, which is a legendary venue. And it also contained a little pop-up museum and shop thing where they had memorabilia and rare photos from the band's 30-year career, and they also had some exclusive merchandise that was available only at this exclusive gig. So that's a pretty cool and fun way to promote your band and really connect with your fans there. And then, of course, present day, and that history has yet to be written. The guys are still in the process of working on their next album, which hopefully will be out sometime next year, I'm hoping, based on their schedule. Of course, COVID kind of put them behind for a while, so they weren't able to work on it. So hopefully we'll get a new album here sometime after Jerry does his next tour, I'm guessing after his new solo album comes out later this year. So we'll see what other interesting things maybe occur in the future for the band. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this little video checking out some of the lesser known factoids and history of one of the greatest bands of the 90s and maybe one of the greatest all time, Alice in Chains. So like and subscribe if you guys enjoyed that. Leave a comment down below if you want. Maybe you got some info that I didn't mention in this video or that is even more secretive than things that I've already said. Don't forget to click the bell so you get a notification when new videos are out, and I'll see you guys next time in another video. Have a good one.